perfection doesn't exist for anybody. And it's not about perfection in that, but it's about kind of making sure we're oriented towards that. And then saying, look, here's the journey. And you might be way over here, but so long as you're oriented and slowly, however painstakingly slowly, you're making your way towards that core, that center, and slowly becoming more and more aware of yourself and of your surroundings and of the earth, and like kind of beginning to get a greater sense of consciousness and awareness and the interconnectivity of everything. That's all a journey towards that. And we're all at various stages of that journey. Hey.
Stevan, it's so great to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ella. It's nice to be here. Feels good.
Yeah, it does. I want to first just let you know how excited I am to be speaking this year at the Planted Expo in Toronto and Seattle. So thank you for inviting me to come.
Grateful to be able to work with people like yourself. It really is about the voices and the businesses that are present. We are just kind of like a little bit of a backdrop. We have some organizational skills, some event skills, and we're really committed to making sure that a plant-based, sustainable, vegan future is more and more accessible for everybody. And so, yeah, I'm very excited. We're less than 60 days now away from Toronto. So it's, and then it's back to back to back for us, right? Toronto, and then 30 days later, Seattle, and then just 5 weeks after that, Vancouver. So it's an exciting season for us. We're really excited to be in Seattle and to be stateside. That's a dream come true for our group.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to talking more about that in a little bit, but what I'm most interested in is kind of the human side of all of this and really you. And I know from just the research I've done and listening to you on other podcasts and reading that you're a very multi-layered human being. And I'm really curious to know how you'll answer a question that I ask many of my guests. And that is beyond the bio, right? And all the accomplishments and these big events that you put on. Who is Stevan? Who are you? Like the being that is you. How would you answer that?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. I think I'm innately curious. And also kind of innately pseudo confident that I can learn a lot, and also not particularly fearful of maybe kind of some of the things that sometimes are kind of core fears in people's lives. So I show up like kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, like, oh wow, what's that? Like, I have this like capacity to see lots and then become hyper-focused on something that intrigues me. So, I mean, as a kid, that might manifest itself in something like skateboarding or playing the guitar or a sport. It might have been like a particular historical event or individual that I found interesting for a season. And then I read and devour and learn as much as I can. So in some ways, like people have described me, I don't know, it always sounds weird to me. Like I have a hard time sort of fully embracing it. Like, people have described me as a bit of a like Renaissance man. So, I'm at home dabbling. And that's the problem. It's a bit of a jack of all trades, but master of none reality for me. Like, I know just enough about, say, music to like, if I was in a group of people and we were talking about some like ways to maybe do music together, I would like kind of like not feel totally lost. Although as soon as I'm in a room of like professional musicians, I'm like, oh dang, I'm way in over my head. But like cool amateurs, I could do that. And it's the same thing. Like I bake professionally because I became enamored with sourdough baking and making sourdough bread. And people are like, oh, where did you learn? I was like, oh, I'm just self-taught. Like one day I thought I want to eat good bread again, and I want to learn all the ins and outs of wheat and agriculture and how it's grown and how it's made. And I just like read everything and listened to everything and then practiced until now I can bake professionally as a sourdough baker. Like, so just as an example, like you asked, who am I? Just like hyper curious, willing to try things, um, you know, but at some level too, like also that, some people have called me like distracted, or, there's somebody who moves on from one project to the next rather quickly. Like those are some of the shadow sides of that, where I don't play guitar as much as I used to. I don't, there's a lot of things I used to do a lot that I don't do anymore, because I was interested for a season, and now it's like that's a part of my history, but it's not who I am today. So I don't know. That's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's a good one. I'm also, profoundly connected to people. Like I love being a dad. Those relationships with my 3 kids, they're all such unique people. And so I'm always feeling like I'm pushed outside of my everyday comfort zone, and I'm having to kind of see myself in them, and then also see them for who they're becoming. And so I've got a 16-year-old like just turned 16. I've got a 13-year-old just headed into like the heart of adolescence. And then I've got a 4-year-old, a sweet little girl who is, precocious and wonderful and reminding me of all of those wonderful ages again. So there's quite a gap. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. I could go on and on. I guess you can get people talking about themselves and away they go, right? Like, I don't know. I could say a lot.
Yeah, well, no, I think, and curiosity, the way I see it, it's such a superpower. I mean, it just opens so many doors. And have you always been curious? Is that something like from day one that's just been kind of who you are? Part of who you are is curious.
I think
Which is
so.
great. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. And I can relate a little bit too to the jack of all trades, being an entrepreneur, being a solopreneur as well. You kind of learn all sorts of things, and doors open and you want to go through them. And they might be very different from the last door you went through. So I get that. I get that. The other thing that I think I can relate to you is an evolving relationship with food and your body, and intersections with spirituality throughout our lives. And if you're up for it, I would love to move in the direction of kind of walking through the evolution of those relationships for you, maybe starting in childhood. I know that's a very kind of broad topic, but maybe, if you can kind of think back to childhood and that relationship you had with food, and how that started to shift and evolve. I know you had the knee injury in high school and all that, but where like with that question, what kind of comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, my earliest memories with food are good ones.
Yeah.
Like in general, I have experienced the power of shared meals and food together, and the art of cooking and flavors, and kind of all of that ability to kind of pour yourself and love and the intangible components of what it means to be human into the creative act of cooking and or baking or whatever the case may be. So, like my memories are of my grandmother and my mom. Like those are my earliest memories. They're people that loved me. I knew they loved me. And then, like the next concentric circle of people, aunties and uncles and friends, etc. They coming from an Eastern European culture, like, and I think, frankly, I just think it's a universal sort of human thing that food is at the core of many family experiences. It's certainly at the core of a lot of like my loving relationships. And so I felt cared for, and I felt invited to participate. when I would sit there and make, for example, donuts with my mom. We have these donuts in Serbo-Croatian culture called ušta. I'm so bad at Serbo-Croatian nowadays. Uštipci. If there's any Serbo-Croatians listening, they're probably like, what the heck is he talking about? No, I'm pretty sure that's what they're called. But it's basically fried dough. They're like wild shaped. They're not like what we, North American culture, what we think of as a donut is, it's got a particular shape, it's got a hole or whatever. Like this would be more like a wild fritter, where it doesn't particularly have any shape, and it's not in and of itself flavored, but it's a fried dough, and you would cut it open and you'd fill it with whatever you wanted to fill it with, and they could be either savory or sweet. So just this is kind of one really important memory. And I remember, I can like I can close my eyes right now, and I can picture the stainless steel pot filled with oil, and I can picture the yellow kind of Tupperware container that my mom had filled with this yeasty dough, and how she would kind of scoop it up and put it in the oil, and then watching all the little bubbles form around, like just classic frying of dough, frying of donuts, and the smell, and how much I was looking forward to, dusting them in sugar and cutting them open and putting my favorite cream cheese and jam in there and like eating 6 of them. So, those are some of my earliest memories. I remember feeling good again. I remember it just being like frequently tied to visitors, people coming over.
That connection, as food as connection, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some of my earliest memories. When did I start kind of recognizing like some level of, I don't know what the right language is. Is it dysfunction, or is it like a shadowy side to it where it wasn't just love and appreciation and flavors and smells? That was much, much later in life, like into young adulthood. I certainly I couldn't put 2 and 2 together as like this idea. Like I didn't have the self-awareness to know that food was a coping mechanism for me. I certainly didn't have the language early on in my like adolescence, teenage years, or even like in college, maybe I started to figure it out in college. Like, and we're talking like really early, like 2000, like a long time ago now. I'm getting old, but yeah, like that's when I would have started to recognize like, oh, wait a minute. Food is taking on a different, it's playing a different role in my life now. Like food was becoming a little bit more isolated. It was something I might do by myself. It was something that I might obsess about, and might be kind of like twirling around in my mind's eye, and thinking about like all of the like, is this good for me? Isn't this good for me? All of those additional questions like, what's its nutritional value, or how is this going to affect me? And that was because I, as you mentioned, in my last year of high school, gained like 65 or 70 pounds of weight. And that just goes to show you how totally disconnected from my body I was, and from its connection to food. Like I had a catastrophic knee injury skateboarding, like you do when you're in high school. And I just kept eating. I just kept eating the way I'd always eaten. And yeah, it was like high school's hard at the best of times. And if you have a knee injury and you're working and, whatever high school drama there is in one's life. I found myself in the midst of my grade 12 year, like completely unrecognizable to myself, like having to buy a whole new wardrobe because nothing I owned in the previous year fit me by the time, like, and it was gradual, but like you just sort of one day wake up and you're like, oh, I am profoundly ashamed of who I am. And that was the beginning of like, literally, Ella, like I went I went probably very close to 2 decades with almost nobody outside of myself seeing me with my shirt
Mhm.
off. Like profound shame.
So this shame that you felt, was this all behind, I mean, shame lives in silence, right? So you are internalizing this. What was that like to the people around you? Were you able to hide that? How did that manifest in the other things that you were doing in your life?
Yeah, I mean, mostly I dealt with the shame component of it, uh, you know, in isolation. Yeah, by myself, beating myself up, vicious cycles of yo-yo dieting and trying to figure it out and working through how to make sense of this in my life. Uh, were there some people kind of brought in at some level? Sure. But frankly, I hadn't even come to grips with it in my own self. So like, how do you really bring, I'm still coming to grips with it. But like, how do you really bring somebody into that when it feels so, um, like it's just scary.
Yeah.
It was just like a really fearful thing. And you feel out of control and you don't really know what just happened or how it happened or what it means. Like really for me, I think now as I reflect, like I just didn't know what all of it meant. Like, why was this happening? And at some level you can chalk it up to the like the logic of it, right? Like super active kid, has catastrophic knee injury, was eating like an active athletic kid, continued to do that, and then lo and behold, found themselves, in an awkward situation that was, the hole was too deep to dig out of, or to let yourself out. I dug too deep a hole or whatever. But,
Mm-hmm.
I think there was way more, and it started sooner than that. Like, sometimes you can mask you're growing super fast in adolescence. Like I was, you go through your growth spurts, you're athletic or whatever. And I was probably already using food as a coping mechanism long before that in my life. But because you're growing so fast and you're dealing with life in the way that you're dealing with it as a kid, and it's just not a thing, I don't know how far back to trace any of that.
Right.
But yeah, like, look, I got married fairly young. So, my partner in life, like she was aware of my struggles at some level, but again, oh man, that's a different podcast.
Mm.
That's a really complicated conversation for how that all played out. But to say that it didn't play a role, like it was all encompassing. Like, yeah, even the most intimate of my relationships were deeply impacted by this relationship to food and relationship to my body and my disconnection from all of those things. It played itself out in really dramatic ways later on. Like, yeah, I don't know how far down the road I want to go in this podcast with some of that, but like it was a lot. Like
Yeah.
it was a lot. So, and my best friends knew, like they were kind of along the like dieting journey of like, because all of us, we're all whatever guys that are, you hear that story of like getting a dad's bod or whatever. Like we were all dealing with it in our own ways. And so we're all kind of on the surface talking about like, oh, don't eat that junk food, or like, what does it look like to, whatever, be healthier and exercise more, or whatever, like all the whole dieting exercise side of things.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting too is that at this point, you went vegan in, I believe, 2003. Is that correct? So, yeah. So there's this, we're talking about layers here because, it was my 20s from 2001-ish to the end of my 20s when I had my bulk of disordered eating and distorted body image and all of this stuff. And at the same time, there's this passion for veganism and this passion for whole foods, plant-based, which I know you went through the vegan junk food and then around 2011 went the whole foods, plant-based route. And so you had that all going on at the same time. And so how did that all fit together for you in your mind? And at what point were you also like really promoting the vegan lifestyle to others? And how did that all kind of connect, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, it all does eventually converge,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
certainly didn't converge at the beginning. So I was raised in a religious environment where some exposure to vegetarianism and veganism was kind of part and parcel. So I was raised a Seventh-day Adventist, and in my early or late teens and early 20s, I studied to be an Adventist pastor, a minister, like a church leader. And so because anybody that's familiar with Blue Zones and has seen the Netflix documentary of Dan Buettner or read any of his works previously, or frankly has delved into any of the academic health literature on the benefits of plant-based, vegetarian, vegan type lifestyles, is familiar with the Adventist world.
Yep.
And so I had that leg up, even though as a kid I was raised in an Adventist home. Most kind of like Eastern European or like international Adventists are actually not vegan or vegetarian. Like that's one of the weird things I get people here like, oh, you're part of that church, that means you're vegan or vegetarian. It's actually just a small subset of particularly white Southern Californian, mostly Adventists in and around Loma Linda that really kind of subscribe to this in any sort of, to any great degree. Anyways, but because of that connection, when I started to kind of worry about my health and worry about my well-being, I was exposed to people that were not Adventist, but whom Adventists adored, guys like Neil Barnard and Joel Furman and some of these other characters that like said, hey, look, the scientific literature and the best of what we can sense is like, hey, this is a good way to, and it was all like Adventists saying, see, even the scientific non-religious community says this is the best way to live. And so I knew of these books, and so I read Joel Furman's Eat to Live in 2003, and that's what really sort of clinched it for me from like that nutritarian concept of like just I've always been interested in this idea of like what's your best bang for buck in your like finances, like and I was like, oh, like I can think about food as a best bang for buck.
Yeah.
And like what's going to give me the most nutritious caloric bang for buck. And I was like, oh, this makes perfect sense to me. Even though it took me years to kind of figure out how that all pieces together, that concept was really compelling to me. And so that's why it was mostly for health reasons. The ethical side of veganism in terms of like animal rights, and then the environmental justice side and the ecological side came also after down the road. So it was primarily sort of health and human welfare that was the beginning there. And so you said like, how did it, like, when did I start promoting veganism? Like from the animal rights, again, I've always loved animals, but like how it all connected, like whether or not, for example, whether or not I would buy a vehicle with a leather interior, just as an example of like veganism, right? Like veganism is more than just the health, and it's more than whole food plant-based. And I think there's a lot of whole food plant-based people that frankly don't care if their car's leather or not. They're not vegan.
Yeah, for sure.
They're vegan in their diet, but they're not necessarily vegan in their lifestyle entirely. And so that would have described elements of myself for a long time. And I think there are many people like, so when I say I was a vegan in 2003, that was really what I mean. Like my diet was vegan.
Got it.
Like it took several years, you know, for me to like say, well, you know what, I don't really need to do that. Like if I ever do something like that, like I'm going to make the vegan choice. And that was because, you know, once you start going down that road, you just become aware of it more and more. And I truly believe that the more of these things that stack together, you begin to realize like there's almost no reason not to be plant-based vegan in your choices. Just it's the lightest way, most compassionate way to engage. So from the cooking health perspective, like almost from the get-go, I was like, hey, if somebody wants to listen and I've got an opportunity to share part of my story, I'll share it. And then, you know, all the other parts started to fit together, you know, over the course of time. And probably in about the same time, 2011, 2012 is when like the vegan shoe fully dropped for me. And I was like, oh, okay, like, yeah, that's now a way of life entirely. Like So yeah, and then the Planted Expo and that kind of thing, was just an opportunity, a transition professionally from doing one thing professionally in my life, and then looking for like what are some ways that I might utilize some of the things I learned in my kind of previous professional life, and what would I be passionate to do, and like organizing large events, and kind of curating an experience over the course of a weekend was something I did professionally for over a decade. I thought, a lot of this will transfer. So maybe I can do that for the vegan community. And it dovetailed well with kind of my sense of working my way through the world.
Well, at what point did things start to shift for you in terms of your relationship with food? What was there a turning point? Did it slowly, like how did that happen for you?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I frequently tell the story of chasing my kid around. So my oldest, I just said, was 16, and he was a toddler, like in and around 2 years old. And we were outside, and he took up a flight of stairs, and just like I kind of gave him a bit of a head start, but he just kept plowing through. And I was like making a beeline up those same flight of stairs trying to catch him. And at the top of the stairs, like my heart was racing. So, and I would have been like somewhere in the neighborhood of like 240, 250 pounds. And I'm only like 5'10". So that's a lot of weight on a 5'10" frame. And I was just like, I can't do this. And it was one of those things, like I had yo-yoed and kind of figured it out. And I've been kind of pseudo trying to eat a healthy vegan lifestyle for several years, like nearly a decade at that point. But it never really clicked. And then I was like, man, if I don't change something, like I'm not going to be able to be the dad I want to be for these kids as they grow up. And so I just decided that was it. And that was the first time I kind of figured out a fair bit of kind of removing the vast majority of like the junk food side of ultra processed, if you know what I mean. And I dropped 50 pounds and kind of kept it off, and went from like hovering for the vast majority of my 20s in like that 250-pound range to like hovering in and around 200 pounds, and felt a lot better about myself, and was able to kind of return to a level of activity and a level of self-awareness around my body and some of those things. But yeah, not really fully piecing together the emotional side of it yet. Just kind of putting in some really strong guardrails that were like, yes, no. And it was just clear, like this was a no food and this was a yes food. And then over time, the yes and no foods changed, and you kind of try to figure that out a little bit. But really that's the story. And yeah, it was that profound of a moment, believe it or not.
Wow. And then since then, and so did you do the whole oil and sugar-free thing?
So sugar-free, no processed sugars,
right? That's
like
that's
no
what
added
I mean.
sugars.
Yeah, that's
but like I consumed enormous amounts of fruit, right? Which
yeah.
for some people is like, that's still sugar. And I was like, man, I'll eat 12 apples today. No problem.
Yes, no.
But yes, I definitely did the no oil. And frankly, my body actually responds to this very day. Like if I feel like I'm struggling or whatever, and I just want to see like immediate results, I think everybody needs to learn to eat a little bit intuitively, and there's no one size fits all whole food plant-based approach. And is olive oil good or bad? Like I don't know enough. I'm ignorant. I just know how my body operates. And if I want to see myself thin out but still eat enormous amounts of food, like in terms of volume, like salads and fruits and all of the other things, then for me, being being oil-free or as low fat as possible in terms of like added fats, I'll still eat avocados and cashews and nuts and that kind of thing. But if I really want to just drop, like just cutting all of the added fats, which are frankly where the flavor comes from a lot of the time. But yeah, like my body responds immediately. Like I drop weight and I thin out super fast.
Got it.
Yeah.
What's in your toolkit now for dealing with stress and negative emotions and things that would have in the past derailed you completely? instead of turning to food.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, this is going to sound like your classic self-help, like all the latest podcasts and literature and newsletters and all the rest of it. But, you know, I have turned to things like breath work and yoga as an important tool in my toolkit. So anything that slows me down, my mind races, right? And when I'm in a stressful mode, I can go into like problem solving and just getting more active and getting busier. Like if I just do this, like I will, whittle away at this to-do list and I'll feel better about myself. And it's like, it's the complete opposite of what I should be doing, which is like saying no and basically anything that declutters my mind and allows me to be present to myself is the key de-stressor. And that's easier said than done, but I have some good new habits around that is very helpful for me. I still have some strong boundaries around what's available to me if I should choose. And that's the thing, right? Like, this, Ella. Food is one of those things, unlike alcohol, unlike gambling, unlike sex, unlike a lot of things. Like, if you have a problematic relationship to something, there are a lot of things you could just say, I'm never doing that again. And you could be abstinent, yes. Should one choose, right? But with food, you can't be abstinent, right? Like, unless you're open to just like perishing. So it is a constant renegotiation. And then because I'm such a social creature and actually really believe in the cultural significance of food, I believe that we should cook. I believe that we should allow it to be the culinary arts. I think that's a good thing. I think food should be beautiful. It should smell beautiful. It should taste beautiful. I'm not a super pragmatic guy when it comes to food. Like I really do believe in all of that side of it. So because of that, because I'm a social creature, because I believe in the capacity for food to bring people together, and I also want to be like super no judgment. That means I want to be able to allow things to be around me and people to be around me and flavors and food choices that may not be the best for me given my history and everything that I wrestle with, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's inherently not a food option for everybody.
Right.
Like there's lots of people that can consume these things in the ways that they consume them and have it be a healthy choice or an appropriate choice. So like maybe healthy is not the right language to use there, and that's just not the right way to frame it, but an appropriate choice. And I want to be able to be in those spaces with those people, whether they're my kids or my friends or just anybody. I want to be able to be in that kind of environment and say, this makes sense, like this is okay. But that does come with the like always being able to negotiate those scenarios, in appropriate ways. And I go back and forth in my capacity to do that well. And so, this is still a journey I'm on. This is not like I've got all these tools in my toolkit and now the struggle is over and I'm on the other side and I've like got whatever, some level of mastery over this. I don't know that I have mastery. Far from it. It feels like some days I'm struggling as much as ever, but in general, the trajectory is this way, right? Like, so it ebbs and flows, but like still, like if I wake up at the start of every year and say like, what is my relationship to my body? What is my relationship to my own sense of self-worth? What is my relationship to food? How do I negotiate social circles and all the rest of it? I would just say, in general, I'm still headed in the right direction, which is really encouraging to me.
It's certainly not a linear path. Like that's,
it hasn't been for me anyways.
No, and it isn't. It hasn't been for me either. There's still some trigger foods, and I have to admit what some of the ones for me are. Vegan butters in general. I don't buy those. There's something about like some of the vegan cheeses. And I think it goes back to that very intense. I mean, there's a lot of fat. There's a lot of coconut oil in a lot of those cheeses. So yeah, there's still some trigger foods that I'm aware of, and setting those boundaries and in more stressful months, things are harder. and it's a journey that's gonna last forever, and the more we can embrace that, the better.
Yeah.
Speaking of vegan cheeses, I am gonna try a bunch of them at Planted Expo. At what point did you how did Planted Expo come to be?
Yeah, it was some friends of mine that actually started it in 2014 in Vancouver. And back then it was known as the Veg Expo, and it was a one-day event. And it was something that slowly grew, as the plant-based kind of vegan niche, was also coming of age, and social media and all the rest of it, it grew alongside of it. At some point or another, those friends it just wasn't the thing for them anymore. And they'd asked me kind of 3 years in a row, like, would you consider taking this over and kind of buying the business from us? And I wasn't in a place, both professionally, family wise, like just on a lot of levels. I wasn't in a place until 2019 when I finally said, hey, is that still an option? Because I'm kind of looking for a new gig and something new to do. And I have some ideas about how I would do this differently than you guys have been doing it. But I think like sort of based in the same premise of like bringing people together and brands together to give people an opportunity to intersect with the best of what the plant-based and vegan business community has to offer to the wider consumer. Mm-hmm. And so, that all sort of transpired, about 4.5 years ago, 5 years, almost 5 years ago. Yeah. And so, but we dealt with the pandemic in the midst of that.
Yeah.
So rebranded it from the Veg Expo to the Planted Expo. Just because, again, veganism, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, is a lot broader than simply, vegetables and food. Like there are a lot of other things that are part of the plant-based vegan lifestyle. And it seemed like that was the nomenclature, the language that was being used more and more. A lot of products and services were being branded as plant-based as opposed to vegan. And we can go back and forth on all of the pros and cons of all of that stuff. But the bottom line is this approach that reduces and eliminates the harm done to animals, and hopes to embrace the most sustainable ecological and agricultural practices, and to the best of our ability is as health promoting as possible. Mm-hmm. Those are all things that mattered a lot. And so we've got this amazing team. Frankly, look, the Planted Expo is the team. Yeah, I get to be on these podcasts, and sure, the title is like majority owner, but I feel like I'm just one person in the midst of an amazing group of people that like come together, and they're pros and they know what they're doing and they love it. And they're totally dedicated to making sure that, when somebody signs on, either buys the, a $20 ticket to come to the event and chow down and buy and get great deals, or they're a brand that's looking to engage with their core, the core person that is looking to purchase these things and or incorporate more and more vegan plant-based products into their life. Like our job is to make sure that it's an awesome event, which is why we bring in amazing voices like yours, Ella, so that people come and say, wow, like somebody like her has been vegan for how long, and she's like that's so inspiring. So it's kind of pulling as much of that positive energy into a room over the course of a weekend and saying, like, this is awesome. This is amazing. not we're amazing, but like it's only amazing because you have the right people in the room, mm-hmm. and the right brands in the room. So
yeah, and I love how you have such a good mix of all these different brands and all these, people getting to come and try these foods of all different types, and then having these amazing speakers and mm-hmm. Chuck Carroll interviewing Dr. Michael Greger. How fabulous is that? What are you most excited about? Or do you have some things that you're really excited about for this year?
Yeah, believe it or not, I'm actually really excited. We're doing a small little vegan fashion show on the Saturday of Toronto and Vancouver. It's sadly not coming to Seattle, but an individual that started the vegan fashion show is actually one of the speakers at our event, and said, why don't we do like a small vegan fashion show activation as part of my time on stage, and we'll bring some brands together and like do a small version of what could be a much larger. So I think that's really cool. That's something we've never done before. And I think it speaks to the maturity of what's available now. Like there are, I don't know how into vegan fashion you are, Ella, but there are like some really cool products out there that mimic leather, mimic wool,
Yes.
mimic all kinds of things that are, that are cool. And there's amazing designers putting their, all of their creative fashionista powers behind these things.
Yeah.
And so we're pretty pumped about that. I think that's an interesting angle that we've never done before. And I think it's going to add another layer to what we're doing. Not that other vegan fashion brands haven't been there before, but to like really feature it that way, I think is cool. Yeah, I mean, obviously the big VIP event in Toronto with Chuck and Dr. Greger is going to be awesome. Like, they're both such characters.
Yeah.
I think they're going to be great on stage together. That's really fun. And just to see the maturation of some of the brands that were just like emerging brands a year ago. And then, seeing all the new products, seeing some of the new voices that are on our stage. Every year has got like kind of that core energy to it. And then the twists and turns of, how one specific event may come together. Those things have got me really excited.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Question, like this is a little shifting back, but
No worries.
given your spiritual background, your
Mhm.
religion and all this, I know one of the things that people sometimes get really worked up about is some people calling veganism a religion. I'm just curious kind of what your thoughts are on that.
So the etymology of the word religion, RE is actually a prefix. It's the prefix that we see in a lot of things, to renew something. And to re-lig something. Lig is actually the root for ligaments, right? So what does a ligament do in our body? It makes two bones work together, right? So you've got ligaments in your elbows and your shoulders and your knees, and it connects two major bones in your body, and makes that possible. So to re-lig something, in religion, in its purest sense, is to reconnect, in this sense, humankind to the transcendent. So I think it's actually a positive word, but you have to reclaim it, much like the LGBTQ plus community has taught us to reclaim the word queer, which can be a very positive word if understood correctly. So in that sense, I think veganism can be religious in that positive sense. But when religion becomes about erecting unnecessary walls and drawing lines with those walls regarding who is in and who is out, that's when it becomes problematic, because then it begins to create enemies and it begins to other people and say, you are not like me. And so if veganism behaves in that religious setting, like sort of bad religion, then I think we are doing ourselves a great disservice as a movement when we are actually doing the opposite of religging or reconnecting things. We are disconnecting things. And so if we erect massive walls and we say, you're only allowed into our special group, we're vegans, if you do all of these things perfectly. And if you don't, if you renege on any of these things, or if you occasionally slip up, or if you are only this far along in your journey and not as far along as I am, well, you're not actually vegan and you're not in.
Right.
I know what's in, and I'm going to guard the gate, and here's the wall, and jump over it, climb over it, whatever it takes to do it. But until you climb over and you meet my criteria, you're out. Okay, so former preacher went down a little thing there. But just imagine instead, take all of those walls and instead lay them flat. And say, hey, look, there's a path over there. There's a yellow brick road. There's a path towards something. What is that thing that we're all sort of walking towards? Like, oh, reconnection with ourselves. Oh, reconnection with the earth. Oh, reconnection with the transcendent. Oh, like reconnection with the animals. well, what is the core of that? Well, it's compassion, it's empathy, it's the capacity to see things for what they really are. And so when veganism or plant-based living or health or whatever sort of sees it as a continuum,
Yes,
as something that we are all working towards, and that perfection doesn't exist for anybody, and it's not about perfection in that, but it's about kind of making sure we're oriented towards that, and then saying, look, here's the journey, and you might be way over here, but so long as you're oriented and slowly, however painstakingly slowly, you're making your way towards that core, that center, and slowly becoming more and more aware of yourself and of your surroundings and of the earth, and like kind of beginning to get a greater sense of consciousness and awareness and the interconnectivity of everything. That's all a journey towards that. And we're all at various stages of that journey. And so if veganism can be that, where we say, hey, look, like we want to reduce animal harm, lower that wall and say, this is a journey towards that. And it's a path, and there's arrows and there's way markers and landmarks, and say, oh yeah, like, and here's the thing, you've always been, like, you've traveled, you've hiked, you've walked around a lake, or you've gone from A to B. And when you're like way far away, you're like, oh yeah, where are we even going? Like, what are we looking for? And then as you get closer and closer and closer, you're like, oh man, that is so gorgeous. That is so beautiful. That lake, that vista, that tree, that, that relationship, that experience, that food, that sexual encounter, whatever it is, like you get there and you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. But until you get there, you don't always know what it is you were after. And so I believe, and this is what Planted Expo stands for, is like as inclusive as possible, as absolutely inclusive and possible. And then when we say, here are our boundaries, we express those boundaries as pathways, not as really difficult to scale walls. I don't know if I've explained this well. I hope I have, but like that's the problem. So sometimes veganism functions like bad religion, where we just like in and out,
yes.
either or, you're good or you're bad, you're evil, or, and it's like,
Mhm.
that's really broken and painful and causes a lot of harm. So let's not do that. Let's instead just see people for who they are, see them as human, see them as worthy of our compassion, love, and empathy, and be open-handed.
I think you said that better than I've heard in a long time. That was really beautiful. It was really beautiful. Thank you for that message. I think it's so powerful, and that's, and I mean, the statistics show like the percentage or percentage of the population that's vegan is not actually increasing very high, very quickly, if at all. And I think it is part of that. And we hear, well, you're not really vegan. What's, oh, you did that? Well, what are you calling yourself a vegan for? And it's like, whoa, let's make this, let's open our arms and our hearts to everyone who's curious. Let's get them on board. Let's welcome them with open arms. Isn't that what we want? Instead of criticizing and putting those walls up. So
right. So like, for example, I waited a really long time to get this tattoo.
nice.
And thankfully, I waited long enough to realize that there was a difference between a vegan tattoo and a non-vegan tattoo. I didn't know this. Like, I've been a vegan for years. I didn't realize that there were inks. And
Sure.
I should have, because in food and dyes and all the rest of it. But I just didn't you don't always compute, right?
No.
And I remember the first time somebody eyed me and said, was that tattoo vegan?
Mm-hmm.
I was like, thankfully, it took me like years to decide to get this tattoo. And like, I've only got a couple of tattoos. Like, I haven't really gone down the tattoo road very far, but it's a really meaningful one to me. And I just remember thinking to myself, oh, that's what it feels like to mess up and to have somebody call you on it. Even though I hadn't messed up and I wasn't actually being called on it, I remember the feeling I had when that question was asked. And I was just like, you gotta be kidding me, right? Like, that's not the point.
Right.
And it's like, get over yourself. Like, yeah, that sucks. And in a perfect world, which we don't live in, like, yeah, okay, all of these things would be abundantly clear at all times and in all places. But are we there or not? And so, yeah, just as an example.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. I remember
yeah.
just being, 8 years old and a vegetarian at that point, and my kids in my class would be like, "Well, if you were on a deserted island and you were going to die of starvation, and there was just one deer left, would you not kill and eat that deer?" Like just trying to get me to say something that was unethical or say, so they could be like, "Well, you're not for real." And yeah, being, vegan for as long as I have, the people are just ready to figure out what you're doing wrong. And if we're then feeding that back to other people as vegans and discouraging people.
I call that the adventure in missing the point.
Yes.
It's like you get, there's so many cliches, right? Like you miss the forest for the trees or whatever. Like, there's a lot of ways that this manifests itself, and we're all guilty of it in some level of our life.
Sure.
Right. And, but like, yeah, I think the spirit, so the reason I guess I can articulate that as well as I can, is because I have experienced actual bad religion, like when it's connected to God. And so I've seen like the underbelly of awful religion, and I've seen the underbelly now of awful veganism as well, right? So yeah, look, we're the Planted Expo. There are hundreds of brands over the course of 2 days in different cities, and our premise is like, look, if you've got only one vegan product amongst many, you can bring that one vegan product. Bring it to our event, and but that's the product you're displaying. Now, we take and lead with a lot of benefit of doubt and a lot of trust and a lot of like, hey, you've said you're going to come and you're going to table and exhibit that particular product, but you can't blame an entrepreneur when they have 6 other products that might have honey in them. They're all kind of plant-based,
right?
But they're not vegan, right? And then they have one product that doesn't have honey. Just this has happened. Okay, I'm giving you a real life example.
Yeah.
And they happen to say, well, I've got 4 other products over here. Like you might be interested in those. And kind of forgetting because they didn't necessarily make this product because they're vegan. They just happen to be a foodie and happen to make something, and and they mention it, and then the vegan police write in, like immediately email, did you know that one of your tablers was like promoting products with honey in them? And it's like, okay. You breathe, all of those things we talked about, move our bodies, etc. Wait half an hour, wait an hour, reply the next day kind of thing, and say, hey, thank you so much. We do our very best to make sure that your experience is safe. We're sorry that this was a troubling moment. We weren't happy about it either. That being said, so-and-so is a friend of ours, and, they're trying really hard, and they're not where we're at in their journey. And basically go down the whole thing and really just try to build empathy and hit send. And guess what? Like almost nobody ever replies back. And you're wrong. You're too nice. You're too kind and loving. You're too accommodating. Like nobody, almost never do we get another additional reply that says, no, you got that wrong. Like it should just be. And it's like, okay, we did our job. Like we tried. And sometimes somebody gets carried away because they're not where we're at, and they have anyways, I don't need to repeat myself. I could be redundant, but that's the thing, right? It's a thing.
It's like, if we can all come from this idea that everyone is doing the best they can with the person, with the tools that they have at that moment, and with the experiences, they're coming with their own experiences, their own education, and every day is different, and you go to the next step and you learn something new, and we're all doing the best we can. We can just, lean into that and give each other the benefit of the doubt. Like you said, I think that's really powerful for bringing us together. And I think your event does such an incredible job at just being so welcoming and so inviting and fun, and bringing it all into one space. So I can't wait to be a part of it. I'm so grateful for you for putting it on, for being here, for sharing about it. PlantedLife.com is where people can go for information. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our audience with?
Noella, thank you. I think I've said a lot. Grateful to be on your podcast. Congrats on years of doing this and doing it well. Thank you to your audience for tuning in. I hope you have found something helpful.
Yes, and I hope to see you at the Planted Expo 2024.
Yes.
Thanks, Stevan.
Thanks.
Hey.